Constant for this very interesting talk. Our next speaker is Stavros Assimakopoulos, who will be talking about interpreting beyond the code, the propositional and non-propositional effects of discriminatory discourse. Stavros, we can see your first slide. Whoops, sorry, we can see your first slide, so everything seems to be fine, and so the floor is yours.
So hopefully you can also hear me well. Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Actually, I'll let in like 1 second from my time, Constant. I think I have a not a solution, but a perspective answer to the problem that Didier posed. So we can take it on later. Anyway, back to my stuff now, I guess, which is sort of related to the previous two talks, I think. What I'm going to be talking about today is basically, it's basically the relation between relevance theory and this scholarly field called critical discourse studies. I think we can all agree, and we know for sure, that relevance theory has offered a lot of insights when it comes to all interactional acts that encompass an element of intentional information transmission. And just to give you a couple of examples, there are countless more in Francisco Yusi's page. So reading literature, surfing the internet, getting convinced by advertisements, persuasion, manipulation, all sorts of things have been looked at from a relevance theoretic perspective. In this regard, it has been odd for me why relevance theory hasn't developed so far a more detailed account of the sort of things that critical discourse studies are involved in, are dealing with. In this regard, the aim of this talk is basically to explore rather than offer definitive answers, but I will offer some answers as well, what relevance theory might contribute to and how it stands to benefit from the critical investigation of discourse and ideology as traditionally pursued in critical discourse studies. Now, as the title, much like the title, this quotation as well, like this is an allusion to Deirdre's paper on literary interpretation, from which I've drawn quite a bit of inspiration for trying to identify these parallels between the two ways of thinking about, well, pragmatics and discourse on the other hand. So I will assume, and this is actually a godsend, that everybody has a fairly good knowledge of relevance theory, which means that I won't have to get into the specifics of relevance theory, but I will give you a brief overview of what critical discourse studies is. And basically what critical discourse studies is an area of discourse analysis, I would say, that investigates more specifically how discourse reproduces social domination, which is defined as the power abuse of one group over others, and how this is textually defined, so to say, and reproduced across the board. In this context, discourse is nothing more than, I would say, a representation that's socially shared among different members of a particular group, ideological group or whatnot. And this, we can actually identify, we can actually examine, investigate discourse by looking at how text and talk are produced and make use of different kinds of semiotic resources. And obviously language is a #1 resource in this regard. And discourse encompasses all aspects of the world. So both the actual structures of the material world, the mental world of thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and whatnot, and of course, and most importantly, the social world. And that's why it has this big interest in social domination. And then an idea that I think is very central to critical discourse studies has to do with ideology, which to a certain extent can be identified as a set of system of mental representation, but basically they are quite special in the nature, in the sense that they are a system of beliefs about how people should, deal with life in general, and what outlook they have towards other social groups. And the idea here is that usually ideology are normally simplified systems of beliefs and often manipulated in order to obtain popular support for certain actions. One very important aspect of ideology, which links it, I think, to the whole discussion of non-propositional effects or emotive effects, is that ideology is usually emotive when it comes to its reference to social action. And that's why critical discourse studies deals with ideologies primarily because effectively when you're looking at social domination, you're looking at how different groups of people sort of try to discriminate upon one another. In order to contextualize a bit the discussion, when I started thinking about this sort of question and what cross-fertilization we can have between the two fields, things seem to be a bit, not, it wasn't very promising. So Fairclough, even from 1989, when the field sort of started getting established, had already identified that pragmatics might not be as useful for critical discourse studies. And according to him, the weakness of pragmatics from a critical point of view is basically the individualism, which, as we all know, relevance theory also connects to in many ways. So action in pragmatics is thought of atomistically as emanating wholly from the individual and is conceptualized in terms of strategies that are adopted by the individual speaker to achieve goals and intentions. And the problem with this from a critical discourse analytic perspective is that it understates the extent to which people are caught up in, constrained by, and derive their individual identities from social conventions. So basically, people are identified as well as social sort of creatures, and their discursive practices mirror that. And at the same time, it overstates the extent to which people manipulate language for strategic purposes. And I think that this hints to the idea that people are not always aware that they are expressing something that might be ideologically marked or whatnot. And to link it a bit more to relevance theory, there has been, Deirdre had actually mentioned like these old reviews of relevance, and I think that these are really useful to go back to every now and then. One of the original reviews of relevance by two of major sort of figures in social pragmatics is that relevance theory is irredeemably asocial. And the problem here, I think, in tandem with what Fairclough talks about when it comes to Gricean pragmatics in general, is that people don't necessarily know what they're doing, and basically, people don't necessarily encompass all their intentions in something. So there are things that can be communicated over and above what people want to communicate, and pragmatics, in its conception, in its Gricean conception, in its analytical philosophy conception, perhaps, does not necessarily account for what happens outside of what was intended. And then, the idea, in order to give you a bit of more background with respect to this, the critical discourse studies, the rationale behind this idea is that effectively, when we're talking about social power, and especially social power as it is reproduced through discursive constructions, we're talking about obviously two kinds of social powers, stuff that can come from coercion, which is economic or political, but there are also things that are more subtle in nature, and they are and they reproduce social power relations through ideas that are hegemonic and ideas to which people actually assent without realizing it. So it's not always the case that I would imagine that from a pragmatic perspective, someone can really grasp all ideological ramifications of a particular position or whatnot. And there are many cases, and I'm pretty sure we all have examples of, I don't know, friends, family members or whatnot, who just believe something because, everybody says so, rather than because they've critically thought about this. Since discourse, and especially discourse that legitimates and perpetuates social inequality, is notoriously prone to normalization, critical discourse studies typically focuses on examining the discursive reproduction of ideologies that are actually below the threshold of notice for anyone who accepts them as natural. And this is, I think, the activist bit of critical discourse studies, in the sense that they're trying to focus on these particular meaning constructions that are not very easy to discern. And this obviously creates a bit of an issue when it comes to discussing things from a pragmatic perspective. And at the same time, it should also be acknowledged that discourse is not just socially constitutive, like it affects people's ideologies, but it is also socially conditioned in the sense that it reflects social practices that underlie inequality, and many times this can be even done inadvertently. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure that we've all had the occasion where we said some, like we passed on a politically correct term in order to describe some vulnerable group or whatnot, right? And that's not intentional at the same time. And even though critical discourse studies and cognitive science and the study of cognition generally has not been as rocky as the relationship between critical discourse studies and cognition, here too there are some issues that Wodak actually pinpoints quite nicely. So according to Wodak, a purely cognitive approach is not able to explain the emotional and affective components. Here she talks about anti-Semitism and racism, so of rhetoric, nor the wide range and contextual factors necessary for its mass psychological impact at a specific time in a specific context. And she poses the interesting questions, which I think relevance theory has something to say about. Why are some people affected and others not? Why do some people believe in racist ideologies at specific times rather than others? And why do these ideologies trigger specific actions that have led to the extermination of millions? And of course, another problem, which is more towards how we treat the data and how we look at interpreting data from a pragmatic perspective, a cognitive approach does not and cannot consider indirect meanings and connotations or latent meanings and connotations. So stuff that actually are below the threshold of someone's notice. However, I take it as a given that the gap between critical discourse studies and cognition is not so much, because it's now been argued time and again that basically if something is socially relevant, then it needs to be socially relevant because it takes place within the mind of individuals and social groups. So there is a mental component there. So in order to save me a bit of time, I will move forward to the relevance theoretic perspective. I think that relevance theoretic pragmatics can be very nicely defined, especially in the last few years, as having the domain of examining the intended import of ostensive acts. And these have sort of like, this is the standard sort of discussion around relevance theory in the past few years. However, I think, and it's also been mentioned in the literature, the relevance theory can also offer insight into the way in which information that may not have been intentionally communicated in the first place can end up getting contextually inferred during spontaneous utterance interpretation. And it's not just that it can offer insight, it actually necessitates so. So, according to relevance theory, at least in its original conception, inferential comprehension is basically the object of pragmatics, but at the same time, you can only study it as part of a broader interpretation process. And this interpretation process, which is not specifically tied to ostension, involves recovery not only of the intended message, but also of any other information not necessarily intended by the speaker, which the hearer may derive from the utterance on his own account. So we're talking here about meaning that people get without this necessarily having been intended by the speaker. So this can account for both people trying to manipulate implicitly others, into an ideological stance, and also people just, not realizing that they're being racist, sexist, homophobes, or whatnot when they pass on comments of a specific nature. So, in fact, and as Deirdre has recently underlined when talking about literary interpretation, when we're trying to identify the intended import of an ostensive act, we must necessarily go beyond it and draw some conclusions that the communicator need not necessarily either anticipate or endorse. And I think that this is very closely tied to the automaticity with which comprehension and, by extension, interpretation takes place within the relevance theoretic picture. And the reason for this is obviously that our goal when engaging in interpretation is just to work out positive cognitive effects, right? And these positive cognitive effects obviously were anchored towards the speaker intended ones, but there are others that we can draw on our own based on our own interests or whatever context we bring to bear. So the interpretation process involves the derivation not only of specifically intended logical consequences or implicatures, but also of those that are less specifically intended or even unintended. And here, the obvious example, at least to my mind, is the extent to which implicatures have been re-identified, reappraised within the relevance-theoretic framework in terms of their strength. So basically, a strong implicature is an implicature for which you have direct evidence that the speaker intended you to derive it, and then weaker implicatures are defined as weak implicatures because you cannot have concrete evidence that the speaker wanted you to identify them, right? They're a bit cloudy at the same time. So when combined with the cognitive principle of relevance, so the natural tendency that all humans have to not seek maximal relevance, but to organize the resources so that they are, maximal relevance is achieved, the automaticity of the process by which a communicative stimulus intended import is recovered, I think can be usefully extended to account for both information intentionally given and information intentionally given off. And this is actually part of a response that Sperber and Wilson have provided to May and Talbot's review. And here, I think that I mean, the whole idea is based on a parallel that I've drawn with Deirdre's work on literary interpretation, where she basically suggests that relevance theory rejects the idea that what's communicating is just a simple meaning or message, and that allows it to account for the fact that the import of some communicative, I guess, stimulus may be equally manifest to both writer and reader at a given time, and different parts of it may become more or less manifest to different readers at different time. Now she's talking about literature, obviously, and the sum of the responsibility for constructing the overall interpretation does not just lie with the writer, it also lies with the reader. And this is an idea that I want to take a bit further and sort of apply it to the discussion of ideological stance. I think that in order to do that, we need to distinguish between texts that have an explicit intention to sway ideological attitudes. So, for example, a manifesto, like hate speech, or something that explicitly seeks to sort of drive the hearer to a particular ideological, direction. And here, I think that we can very easily speak about speaker-intended cognitive effects. Like if I'm telling you to go, I don't know, kill or do whatever, to go hit someone, then I'm trying to pass on a message to you. Of course, we shouldn't discount the motive dimension here for sure. But what I find a bit more interesting, and especially in view of the critical discourse studies background, is that there are also texts and messages and utterances and whatnot that seem to mirror dominant ideologies in society without really realizing that they do that. I think that when we're talking about these sort of connotations, because they are connotations effectively, the requisite salience to exert a strong enough impact on the individual's belief system is lacking. So most likely, these are not cognitive effects, or at least full-blown cognitive effects, because they are sort of like indirect and latent and whatnot. And I think that this should be described basically as non-propositional affective reactions that are essentially congruence, that are in congruence or in incongruence with an ideological assumption that is manifest to the addressee. So me reading something in passing can activate a particular assumption in my brain, in my mind, and then seeing whether, like, if what I'm reading or hearing is in line with this, then it will enforce it a bit. If not, it will sort of like clash with it, and it will lead to a reaction. And I think there is a strong emotive component here. In order to give you an example of this, because I'm talking in the wild, here is an example from Grice's Logic and Conversation. I'm pretty sure you've never thought about this before. So when I was reading it, like for the nth time, I figured out that I saw this part where these are actually examples that are provided one next to the other. Of a man known to have broken up all the furniture, one says he was a little intoxicated. And this is an example of meiosis, so it has nothing to do with ideology or anything else. And then exactly after this, you have the example, every girl loves a sailor, which is the example of hyperbole that Grice gave. Now, I think we can all agree that Grice didn't really want to reproduce any gender stereotyping or anything of the sort. But if you think about it, we have a reproduction of a cultural phenomenon that has been shown to contribute to a perpetuation of sexist ideologies, because it reproduces the interaction of men with the relation of men with physical strength and feelings like anger, and of women with warm emotionality. So, a case can be made that this is actually conducive to a sexist ideology, which I would imagine would be dominant and actually not even challenged at the time that Grice wrote this piece. So obviously, I'm not saying that you should all agree with my interpretation, but the thing that I want to emphasize here is that you've read it. Probably this sort of like appeared in your mind as a side effect of you interpreting what Grice was saying, but it was actually my drawing your attention to this particular effect that now enables you to think about it, right? To either accept it, to reject it, because this is just nonsense. I'm not being serious here, or basically disregard it, say that it's not even worth considering, right? But at the same time, you can see here where we have some part of meaning, if you want to call it that, or an effect that has not been intentionally communicated. If anything, I'm pretty sure it was even, completely unintentionally communicated, yet it can have ideological repercussions. And this actually, I think that this actually gives rise to we can actually try and explain all this stuff by referring to the different evaluations that different individuals can have when it comes to cases like the one that I just described. So, for example, another example, Donald Trump says, "Go back to your country." Imagine him saying this during an election rally, where I would imagine he would be cheered, as we've seen in many, many videos of him, or during an official United Nations meeting, where I would imagine he would be, told off, so to say. So basically, the idea here is that whenever someone is sensitive to matters of social inequality, a remark of this sort is bound to lead to an interpretation that underlines its role as a marker of subordination and oppression, but this might not be the case for someone else with a different ideological background, who might endorse it or disregard it because they're not interested in this sort of thing. So I think that, and I will probably cut this short because I'm running out of time. This divergence lies in the corresponding divergence in the context that these individuals construct while interpreting utterances. And this is actually an idea that I've borrowed from Didier and Steve because they've proposed this sort of thing when it comes to studying manipulation. And I think that when we're talking about manipulation, we're talking about implicated premises that are sort of being hidden. I think that the context for interpretation, apart from implicated premises overall, can additionally comprise assumptions that are either way highly accessible to the hearer. So, yeah, I'm not going to say this. And I think that basically we are led to these sort of effects given the automaticity with which pragmatic interpretation takes place. So basically, because we don't even realize this sort of processing, we tend to assent to particular ideological positions or not accept them. And I think that this can account for the derivation of indirect or latent meanings of connotation and the extent to which some people are affected and others not. And I won't answer the last question, and we'll go directly to the conclusion. I think that relevance-theoretic studies have focused, and rightly so, on issues of ideological manipulation, and more specifically deception and persuasion so far. And the reason is that basically meaning that is not related in some ways to the communicator's intentions seems to be falling outside the range of phenomena covered by the discipline of pragmatics and relevance theory by association. However, I think that this cross-fertilization that I'm talking about here could for one, extend the reach of relevance theory, because relevance theory is also a theory of cognition, not just a theory of pragmatics or communication alone, when it comes to studying the actual psychological and microsociological mechanisms involved in non-ostensive forms of interaction. And it can also provide a nice testing ground for the investigation of non-propositional effects, or at least effects that have both a propositional and an affective component. And thank you very much for your patience. Here are the references. And since I was very fast at this, if you want to know more, there is a paper on this in pragmatics and cognition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stavros. So that brings a new perspective on issues of emotive effects, which we haven't really touched on so far. So that's nice. I guess there might be questions related to your talk. So if you could raise your hand, I would then give you the floor.
Maybe I was too fast, so people.
Okay, so Steve, you have a question.
Yes, sorry, I'm confusing the thumbs up and the question. Hi, Stavros. Thanks for your talk. I really sympathize, and I enjoyed it because it also reminds me of a few things I was trying to do a few years back. And this is really a curiosity question. Have you discussed this with the CDS crowd?
Yeah, actually, I have.
I mean, someone outside of Dimitris.
Yes, I have. And the thing is, I mean, they're also their concerns, or to say, I mean, at least those who are familiar with relevance theory, is basically, yeah, we know that there is a lot to say there, but then there is this whole notion of intention. And what we're looking at are these sort of like subversive messages and things that cannot really, that people cannot understand. And my response to this more generally is that if you take up this automatic processing thing, basically, you know, you can explain why people, I don't know, get really passionate about specific things or polarized about specific things when, for example, the news, let's say that there is the migrant crisis and all you hear around you is migration, you're bound to get the context of migration activated again and again and again, which will inevitably lead you to formulate a stance. So I think that this is basically like, regardless of whether something is an intentional message or whatnot, I think that the repetition on its own, alongside the automaticity of the processing, is what creates this effect and this polarization. At the same time, I think that, you know, the easiest answer to this would be, you know, cultural attractor theory. I mean, all these things are cultural attractors, and basically people tend to sort of go around ideologies so that they form groups. But yes, I mean, they are sympathetic to this. They're just trying to figure, I mean, the ones that I've spoken to, they're not discounting this. So yeah.
But back in the day, it was this distinction between psychology and sociology was very much, I mean, polarized distinction was very much to the forefront, and they were looking at what I was saying with a bit of strange eyes because they felt it wasn't really, it was much too reductionist, basically.
I think that they would have the same reaction, and at the same time, what we're talking about here is individual thought. Yeah. But I think there is a story to be said, even when it comes to social cognition and how, like, we manipulate the system in order to do all this stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously not an easy thing to digest. That I'll tell you for sure. But people have been positive, I think, more generally.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, another question. I can't see hands, so if you could. Good. Constant, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, so for me, like the RT explanation part was a bit fast in the end. Like I didn't have really the occasion to get the idea. But what I understood is that the fact that we abandoned the code model where you have one message in the head of the author, for instance, and that is what is needed to be retrieved by the audience is what's important for you, partly the idea of a weak implicature that but isn't the idea of a weak implicature still linked with what is intended to be made manifest, or not?
I think not necessarily. I think that the weakest form of implicatures are completely unintentional ones. At least that's how I take them to be. I mean, obviously we're the company of relevance theorists, so my interpretation is that the stronger the implicature, the more evidence that the speaker has, that the hearer has, that the speaker intended it to be derived. And then the weak implicatures are those that are sort of cloudy and iffy and can be all sorts of things that may not be even related to speaker intentions. So
Okay.
I think, honestly, because I think that this is a problematic, like, sort of area, I would much prefer to use the term implicatum, like a la Grice, sort of like it's not an implicature, it's not intended. So these are implicata, these are things that you can derive of your own accord. But since, we have this distinction in relevance theory, I think it's a bit, far-fetched to sort of try and redefine the will. But I don't think that these would be connected to the intentions necessarily. And then in case of manipulation, this would be masked as not being connected to the intentions of the speaker, but actually they would be. So that's my take, at least, on this.
Okay, well, I guess we don't have much more time, but just a remark is that I think there may be a difference that can still be relevant here, is what is controllable by the author of the speaker, and what is beyond control. And
Absolutely.
we make a difference also, like as interpreter, like if a kid, a 1-year-old, says something racist by repeating like an epithet, a racial epithet, we won't interpret that to be problematic in the way in which
I didn't have time, but I think
didn't intend to be racist, but still had the control, and so just that's an interest of mine. So if you want to discuss about that,
absolutely, yes, absolutely. And I have a thought about this, so we can discuss this later, I guess, afterward. But I think that this is where vigilance enters the picture. Sorry, go on.
And then you can tell me your solution to Didier's worry from before.
Okay, so can we keep the room open?
I'm not in control, so Ryoko will be able to tell us that. But before that, just what you just said, Constant, reminded me of what Steve and I have been working on when we talked about secondhand manipulation. Yep. in our work. Which is quite reminiscent of this case where a child repeats something that they have heard. And yes, you have a problem with the source of the manipulation. At least that is something we had a hard time dealing with. And I think you will have that same problem dealing with ideology.
Oh, that makes sense, yeah. I think that this vigilance, epistemic vigilance, might have something to offer in this regard. Like the extent to which you automatically assume that someone is. But anyway, Ryoko, please tell us what we do.
Okay, yeah, no, well, we can keep this room open, but the 70 people do need a break as well. Yeah, so